The sun of a perfect July morning spilled golden over Main Street, catching the chrome of antique fire engines and the polished brass of the high school marching band's tubas. Flags, crisp and bright, snapped in a gentle breeze from every lamppost. It was Founders' Day, a day of parades and patriotism, and the town of Havenwood had turned out in force. At the center of the reverence, seated on a special viewing stand near the mayor, was Sergeant Elias Thorne. His back was straight, a testament to a discipline decades old, though his hair was the color of winter snow, and his face a roadmap of a life lived through harsh seasons. To the people of Havenwood, he was more than a veteran. He was a monument, a quiet pillar of integrity who ran the local hardware store with a soft word and a firm handshake for everyone. The crowd's applause was a warm, rolling wave as the VFW color guard marched past, their commander dipping the flag in a gesture of profound respect directly to Elias. Then, the wave broke. Two olive-drab vehicles, stark and angular against the parade's cheerful curves, sliced through the procession with surgical precision. They stopped directly in front of the viewing stand. The music faltered, then died completely, leaving a vacuum of stunned silence. 4 military police officers disembarked, their movements economical and grim. They were led by a man whose uniform was so sharply creased it looked like it could cut glass. On his shoulders, the silver eagles of a full colonel glittered. He moved with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to unquestioned authority, his eyes scanning the stand and locking onto Elias Thorne. The colonel, Marcus Vance, held a data slate in his hand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In the unnatural quiet, his words carried like a death knell. Elias Thorne? I am Colonel Marcus Vance, United States Army. I have a warrant for your arrest. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The mayor stood, sputtering. Colonel, there must be some mistake. This is Elias Thorne. He's a town hero. Colonel Vance's eyes, cold and gray as a storm-tossed sea, did not leave Elias. The charge is desertion in the face of the enemy and gross insubordination, stemming from a direct violation of Article 99 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Operation Sundown, April 17, 1983 inch. Elias Thorne did not react. He simply watched the young colonel, his expression unreadable. He looked not at a man, but at a uniform, an instrument of a long-dormant machine that had finally, after 40 years, found its missing gear. With a slow, deliberate motion, he took off the old, faded green beret he held in his lap and began to stand. He didn't protest, he didn't question. He simply accepted, his silence a strange, heavy blanket over the chaotic scene. The MPs moved in, their hands reaching for him. Elias offered his wrists, the weathered skin and swollen knuckles of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. As the first cold, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed over the silent street, his grip on the beret slackened. It slipped from his fingers, a small, forgotten piece of his past, and tumbled to the sun-baked asphalt below. The scene was a portrait of surreal disruption. The festive red, white, and blue banners seemed to mock the grim authority of the olive-drab uniforms. The townspeople, moments before united in celebration, were now a fractured gallery of disbelief and anger. Murmurs swelled into angry shouts. "What are you doing?" someone cried. "Leave him alone. He's an old man." But the MPs were insulated by their training, deaf to the civilian noise. They guided Elias down the steps, their grips firm, their faces impassive masks of duty. Elias moved with them, his gait steady, his gaze fixed on some distant point only he could see. He seemed to shrink, not from fear, but as if compacting his dignity into a small, unbreakable core. The beret lay on the ground, a trampled relic. A little girl, tears welling in her eyes, darted forward to retrieve it for the kind old man from the hardware store, but her mother quickly pulled her back, whispering warnings. The object was now part of the sterile, untouchable perimeter of law enforcement. Colonel Vance watched the proceedings with a detached air of command. This was a loose thread, detail, a bit of administrative house cleaning. An old file had been flagged by a new AI system designed to cross-reference cold cases. A deserter, living under his own name for decades. It was an embarrassment to the service, and Vance was the man sent to clean it up. He was a product of the modern military, efficient, technologically adept, and with a deep, unyielding respect for the regulations that formed the bedrock of his world. A refusal of a direct order in a combat zone was the ultimate sin. It wasn't just insubordination, it was a betrayal of the sacred trust between soldiers. To him, this old man, whatever his current reputation, was a cancer that had been allowed to fester for too long. He gestured to one of his NCOs. "Bag the personal effect as evidence." The sergeant nodded, but Vance, following the protocol he so fiercely believed in, waved him off. "I'll do it." He strode forward, his polished boots stopping inches from the faded green wool. He bent down, his movements precise, and picked up the beret. It felt insubstantial in his gloved hand, a fragile thing smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. The beret was worn, the fabric softened by countless rains and years of being held in anxious hands. The wool was thin in places, the color faded from a deep forest green to a mossy gray. It was a relic from a different army, a different time. Colonel Vance's initial assessment was one of faint disdain. This was the symbol of the man's pride, the very headgear he likely wore on the day he betrayed his unit and his country. Vance was about to drop it into a sterile evidence bag when his thumb brushed against a small, hard irregularity on the folded-over edge. It was a pin, tucked away almost out of sight, not a standard-issue flash or crest. He paused, curiosity momentarily overriding his procedural mindset. He turned the beret over in his hand, his fingers working the pin into the light. It was not military issue. It was small, no bigger than his thumbnail, crafted from a metal that looked like tarnished silver. The design was strange, almost arcane. A serpent, intricately detailed with tiny scales, was coiled around a shepherd's crook. The imagery was a contradiction, the symbol of deceit and the symbol of guidance, intertwined. Vance stared at it, a flicker of confusion crossing his disciplined features. He had seen this symbol before. Not in a training manual, not in a museum, but in a place far deeper and darker within the archives of military intelligence. It was in a heavily redacted file he'd accessed for a historical thesis at the War College, a file that was supposed to have been destroyed. The file spoke of a ghost unit, a phantom entity that officially never existed. They were known, in the whispers of Black Ops lore, as the Shepherds. Their mission profile was classified above top secret, but the rumors said they were sent into impossible situations not to fight, but to discern. To see the truth through the fog of war when command-level intel was compromised or politically motivated. They were auditors of conscience, authorized to make the one call no one else could. Their motto, according to the one unredacted line in the file, was non pro gloria, said pro anima. Not for glory, but for the soul. The unit was disavowed and disbanded after a single, catastrophic operation went sideways, Operation Sundown. Vance's blood ran cold. A sudden, jarring dissonance seized him. The man being loaded into the transport vehicle, this quiet, unassuming hardware store owner, was a traitor according to the official record. A coward who broke in the face of the enemy. But the symbol Vance held in his hand told a different story. It was the mark of a man tasked with making the most difficult moral judgment on a battlefield, a man whose entire purpose was to stand against the tide. The Shepherds weren't cowards. According to the legends, they were the bravest of the brave, because their battles were fought alone, in silence, and their victories were never recorded. He looked from the pin to the old man's back. The calm dignity, the utter lack of resistance, it didn't compute with the profile of a fugitive. Fugitives ran, or they fought, or they pleaded. They didn't stand with the straight-backed resignation of a man finally meeting a fate he had chosen for himself 40 years ago. The crowd's anger was now a palpable force. The mayor was on his phone, shouting at a state senator. Teenagers who'd bought nuts and bolts from Elias were yelling insults at the MPs. A low growl of communal defiance was building. Vance felt the situation slipping from the neat and tidy procedure he had planned. He saw the doubt on the faces of his own men. They were soldiers, but they were also human, and arresting a beloved octogenarian in front of his entire town felt wrong, no matter what the paperwork said. A tremor of uncertainty, an alien feeling for the colonel, ran through him. The pin in his hand felt impossibly heavy, a single ounce of silver that outweighed the entire official report on his data slate. "Hold!" he commanded, his voice sharp. The MPs paused, their hands on the vehicle's door, surprised by the hesitation. Vance strode toward them, his mind racing, trying to reconcile two completely contradictory narratives. He held up the beret, the pin glinting in the sun. He needed to hear it from the man himself. He needed to see his eyes. He stopped directly in front of Elias, blocking his path to the vehicle. Colonel Vance held the beret so Elias could see it, the shepherd's crook pin facing the old man. His voice was no longer the impassive instrument of military justice. It was sharp, intensely focused, the voice of a man demanding a key to a lock he'd just discovered. "Where did you get this pin, Sergeant?" The title was an unconscious reflex, a slip of respect that defied the charges on the warrant. Elias Thorne's eyes, which had been distant, slowly focused on the colonel, and then on the beret in his hand. For a fleeting moment, a universe of pain and memory washed over his features. He looked at the pin, and a deep, ancient sadness seemed to settle into the lines around his eyes. But he said nothing. His silence was not defiant, it was patient. As if he were waiting for the young officer to piece together a puzzle that had been scattered for decades. For Vance, the sight of the pin was now acting as a catalyst, dredging up a memory from the deepest parts of his own history. It wasn't his memory, but his mother's, a story she would tell him on nights when thunderstorms raged outside, a story he'd always dismissed as a child's frightened, fragmented recollection of war. She had been a refugee, a little girl on a packed, rickety bus, part of a civilian convoy fleeing a collapsing city. Her story was always the same: the smell of smoke, the sound of distant explosions growing closer, the terror in the adult's eyes. The convoy had stalled in a narrow valley. Her mother had told everyone to be quiet, to pray. And then, she said, she saw him. On a ridge high above them. A soldier. Just a silhouette against the gray sky, but she could see his green beret. He was looking at them through binoculars. She remembered the sheer, paralyzing terror of being seen, of being a target. They waited for the inevitable, the scream of artillery, the fire from the sky. But it never came. There was only silence. The soldier on the ridge just watched them, and after an eternity, the convoy started moving again, escaping the valley. His mother always called him her angel in a green beret, the soldier who did not fire. Vance squeezed his eyes shut for a second. The valley in his mother's story, it was in the Grid 47 Charlie sector. The time, the date, it all matched the file for Operation Sundown. The scene had shifted. The noise of the parade was a distant, muffled memory. They were in the sterile, beige briefing room of the Havenwood police station. The mayor had arranged it, a small concession to Elias's standing in the community, a place to hold him before the long transport to the federal facility. Vance had dismissed the MPs, ordering them to secure the perimeter. He wanted no witnesses. He needed the truth, unvarnished and unrecorded. He placed the beret on the metal table between them. The shepherd's crook pin seemed to watch him. He sat opposite Elias, the data slate with the official report beside the beret. Operation Sundown. Grid reference 47 Charlie. Vance began, his voice a low, controlled monotone. The official report, signed and certified by Major General William Atherton, states that your unit had eyes on an enemy armor column disguised as a civilian convoy. They were advancing on a strategic pass. The report says you were given a direct order to engage and neutralize with artillery support. He looked up from the slate, his gray eyes locking onto the old man's. The report says you acknowledged the order. And then you shut off your radio. You refused to fire. An act of cowardice that allowed an enemy asset to escape. Elias Thorne listened to the recitation of his sins without a flicker of emotion. It was a story he had lived with for 40 years, a fiction that had become his official truth. He leaned forward slightly, his cuffed hands resting on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy from disuse, but steady as stone. It wasn't disguised as a convoy, Colonel. It was a convoy. Vance felt a prickle of irritation. This was the expected defense of a guilty man. Intel from 3 separate sources confirmed enemy presence. Thermal imaging showed hot spots consistent with engine blocks of T-62 tanks. Vance was quoting the report verbatim, the cold, hard data that had condemned this man. Your commanding officer, Atherton himself, confirmed the visual from his command post. Elias shook his head slowly, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. Intel can be wrong. Machines can be misread. And ambitious men can see whatever they want to see. Vance clenched his jaw. This isn't about ambition, Sergeant. This is about the chain of command. You were a soldier. You had an order. Elias met his gaze, and for the first time, Vance saw not a criminal, but a teacher looking at a student who had yet to understand the most important lesson. I was a soldier, yes. Which is why I was trained to look with my own eyes, not just through the eyes of a satellite or a man miles away from the smoke. The book doesn't always have the right answers, sir. Sometimes it just tells you what the author wants you to believe. He leaned back, his eyes unfocusing as he journeyed back across 4 decades. The thermals were hot, yes. An old bus packed with 80 people runs hot. So do 2 failing truck engines carrying everything a family owns. Atherton saw armor. I saw laundry hanging off the side of a truck. I saw the glint of sunlight off something in the dust, and it wasn't a gun barrel. It was a little girl's doll, the kind with the shiny plastic eyes. It had fallen onto the road. He paused, his voice dropping. I saw a school bus, Colonel. A yellow school bus, covered in mud and filled with children's faces pressed against the glass. Your intel, your confirmed reports, they were a lie. Atherton wanted a medal. He needed a kill. And he was willing to sacrifice a valley full of innocent people to get it. The words struck Colonel Vance with the force of a physical blow. A yellow school bus. His mother's story. It was always the detail he remembered most vividly. We were all so scared. She would say, her voice trembling even years later. I was on a big yellow bus, Marcus, and I was so afraid they would see the color and think we were a target. He stared at Elias, his carefully constructed world of regulations and reports beginning to fracture. The sterile data on his slate was turning to dust, replaced by the terrifying, human image of a child's doll lying in the road. His own mother's face, a girl of 9, was now superimposed over the faces Elias described, pressed against the glass. He felt the air leave his lungs, his voice a strangled whisper. My mother, she was in that convoy. She was on that bus. Elias Thorne's weary eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He looked at the colonel, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a uniform, not as an arresting officer, but as the legacy of a choice he made on a lonely ridge 40 years ago. The silence in the room stretched, thick with the weight of revelation. Vance felt a dizzying vertigo, as if the floor had dropped away from beneath him. The man he had come to arrest, the man he had publicly shamed, the deserter, the traitor, was the angel from his mother's story. He was the reason his mother survived the war. He was the reason Marcus Vance existed at all. The entire edifice of his career, his belief in the system, his identity as an officer, was shaken to its foundation. He had been an instrument of injustice against the very man to whom he owed his life. A wave of shame, so profound and hot it felt like a fever, washed over him. Elias saw the storm in the young colonel's eyes and nodded slowly. There was no triumph in his expression, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only the quiet, profound melancholy of a burden finally shared. "I made my choice," Elias said, his voice soft. "Atherton made his. He buried my field reports, doctored the communications logs, and painted me as a coward who lost his nerve. The enemy armor was reported as escaped. He got his promotion a year later. I was court-martialed in absentia, given a dishonorable discharge I never knew about until your new computer found me. I just disappeared. I knew if I ever tried to fight it, to tell the truth, Atherton's power would crush me, and it might have brought lethal scrutiny back on the people in that convo. His lie had to be absolute. So I let it be. Vance looked at the old man's cuffed hands, the steel bracelets a symbol of a monstrous wrong. You lived with that for 40 years? You never tried to clear your name? Elias offered that same sad, gentle smile. My name was clear in here, he said, tapping his chest lightly. That's the only place it ever really mattered. Knowing those people lived, that those children got to grow up, that was my victory. It was enough. Some things are not for glory, Colonel. They are for the soul. The motto. Non pro gloria, said pro anima. In that moment, Colonel Marcus Vance understood. He stood up, his movements stiff, as if his body had forgotten how to obey him. He walked around the table, his eyes never leaving Elias Thorne's. With hands that trembled, he took the key from his belt and unlocked the handcuffs. The click of the mechanism was deafeningly loud in the quiet room. Elias rubbed his wrists, not out of relief, but as a man waking from a long, troubled sleep. Vance picked up the faded green beret from the table, handling it now not as evidence, but as a holy relic. The tarnished silver pin seemed to pulse with a light of its own. Sergeant Thorne, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, a mixture of awe, shame, and immeasurable gratitude. You are not a traitor. You are a hero. He turned and strode out of the room, leaving Elias alone with his quiet vindication. The next hour was a blur of controlled fury for Vance. He was on a secure satellite phone to the Pentagon, his voice a blade of ice cutting through the chain of command. This is Colonel Marcus Vance. I am officially retracting the arrest warrant for Sergeant Elias Thorne. Furthermore, I am reopening the file on Operation Sundown under direct authority of Article 138. And I am opening a new investigation into the conduct of Major General William Atherton, retired, for falsification of an official report, conduct unbecoming, and what I believe will amount to accessory to war crimes. I have a primary, unassailable witness. The voice on the other end sputtered, but Vance cut them off. Consider this my official testimony. The evidence is irrefutable. The final scene was back on Main Street. The parade was long over, but the crowd had not dispersed. They stood in a silent, massive vigil around the town hall. When the doors opened, it was not the MPs who escorted Elias out, but Colonel Vance himself. Elias blinked in the afternoon sun, looking out at the faces of his neighbors, friends, and customers, their expressions a mixture of confusion and hope. Colonel Vance stepped forward to the top of the stairs, and the crowd hushed. He didn't make a speech. He didn't offer an explanation. He knew that actions, in the end, were the only truth that mattered. He turned to Elias Thorne. Then, in the crisp, formal motion that had been drilled into him since he was a cadet, Colonel Marcus Vance raised his right hand to his brow and delivered the slowest, most profound, and most respectful salute of his entire life. It was a salute from a colonel to a sergeant, but it was more. It was a salute from a son to the man who saved his mother. As he held the salute, with his other hand he gently, reverently, placed the old green beret back on Elias Thorne's head. The small silver pin, the serpent and the shepherd's crook, caught a ray of the descending sun, flashing like a small, brilliant star of redemption. A single tear traced a path through the dust on Elias's cheek. And the crowd, understanding everything without a word being spoken, erupted not in cheers, but in a wave of deep, heartfelt, and tearful applause. Justice, after a 40-year winter, had finally come home.